Because architecture is such a powerful lens through which to ask questions about religion, about gender and race. And so for this series, we asked the guiding question, how do space and culture interact? For this session, I'm so pleased to welcome award-winning architect Maryam Eskandari. Maryam is the founder of MIIM Designs, a multidisciplinary studio in the vanguard of creating sacred spaces that address contemporary needs through sustainable materials. Her work has been recognized through notable awards, including the National Endowment for the Arts, the Doris Duke Award in Architecture, the Harvard Alumni Association Award in Architecture and Design, the Women Entrepreneur Award, presented at the White House under President Barack Obama. I'm also overjoyed to introduce my co-host and respondent, Dr. Michael Crosby. Mike is professor of architecture at the University of Hartford in Connecticut. He served as editor-in-chief of Faith Informed magazine, the interfaith journal on religion, art, and architecture since 2001. He's the author of many books and articles on architecture, design, and practice. And without further ado, I'll pass the floor over to you, Maryam.
Well, thank you so much for having me this evening at East Coast time. Still kind of a lovely afternoon here in California, in Southern California. I'm really delighted to be sharing some of the work that we've been doing over the past decade and a half. And I'm just going to go ahead and get right to it because there's so much to cover. I'm basically squishing in a semester's worth of, classes into this literally 20-minute talk. So bear with me as we go through things. So this evening, Michael and Vanessa had asked me to basically talk about the issue of sacred space. And let me go ahead and, so this evening, Michael and Vanessa had asked me to basically talk about the issue of sacred space. And I wanted to actually start off the conversation this evening with a couple questions that we started off when we came to do this research. When even the inception of MIIM Designs came about through the notion of trying to figure out what is, Islamic architecture in America, what is the definition of a mosque, what does it mean to have an American Muslim identity, and so on and so forth. So there was a lot of questions that we were trying to unpack. And we had to do it very delicately throughout many years. But I think in order to ask those questions and to come to an understanding, I wanted to first step back to give a brief history of the American Muslim history that happened here in the US. Obviously, this is the percentage of the population of Muslims around the world. You can see that the United States and North America roughly holds about somewhere between 7 and 15% of the Muslims. So there's about 8 billion, there's about 1 billion Muslims in the 8 billion population that resides on Earth. So 7 to 15% is quite a lot. It's not as strong as other regions of the world, but it's still relatively high considering other parts. 7 to 15% right now, the last time that it was counted and we were doing the research, it's roughly about 9.5 million Muslims here in the US, and they reside in different regions. And the reality is that the American Muslim story starts off in 1492, when Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand decided to set Columbus to the United States. And prior to that, there was a whole bunch of, things that were happening in Europe before 1492. So the Ottomans had already invaded Portugal and Spain. There was the Crusades that were taking place when Spain still held its ground. Many of the Muslims that had come into that region, they were either given two options. The first one was you either convert to Catholicism. The second one was you die. So those were the two options that were given. Then when Columbus decided to set sail to find India, because they no longer wanted to go through land through the Silk Route, but it was now trying to, in order to avoid the Ottoman Empire, they decided to go through water. And, and this is where he came to the Americas thinking he found India. But with him was a third category. So the people who chose not death, chose not to convert to Catholicism, but basically they were the slaves that were put on the boat, and they were Muslims, and so they were brought to the Americas. And so as more of these crusaders came over, they also brought more Muslims with them under the notion of slavery. And this is a really interesting one. Mustafa Zemmour, which is a deep history about him, was brought in through slavery with a Portuguese ship. And he's one of the very first Muslims that were documented here in the United States. His story is fascinating because not only was he brought in, but he actually kind of made his way all the way to what we know today as New Mexico. So he was quite an extensive traveler throughout the Americas. To put things into perspective, in 1607, the Virginia Company was founded in Jamestown, and in order for each of these cities or towns to be established, more slaves were brought in, and most of the slaves were of Muslim background. So here we go, the Puritans in 1630 were also coming in. This is where the Massachusetts Bay Colony was basically growing. And then somewhere between 1675 to the 1700s, roughly about 6,000 African slaves of Muslim descent were brought in to Virginia and Maryland. So we're now seeing an influx of Muslims. Now, in the course that I teach, the history theory course that I teach to my undergrads, we actually get into this region because I talk about how it's the Muslim slaves were put up against the indigenous communities. And how their principles would not allow for them to fight with each other, whereas they had no choice but to either come to an agreement or to be killed, because the white man basically told them you have to kill each other to figure out who gets the land. But then to carry on, in 1731, another 6,000 slaves, Muslim slaves were brought in. These are now into the Louisiana area. And then in history, we have that the first recorded mosque was actually built in the United States at 1731. So this is at the point where Muslims were hiding their Muslim identity. They didn't want their slave owners to find out because they didn't want to be, killed off. But what they started to do was they started to create areas where pre-existing buildings were there, and this is where the first mosques were established. And again, to put that's roughly about 40 years prior to our Independence Day. So that kind of says a lot about our American history here. Another well-known Muslim was Yarub Mahmoud. His whole legacy is now hanging at the African American Museum in DC. He became a very well-known businessman, and he plays a significant role in the American Muslim identity as well. Another one was Muhammad Alexander Russell Webb. Muhammad Alexander was actually a Yankee Muslim, so he was actually a white Muslim, a white man who then converted to being Muslim. But he had a significant role to play in the 19th century, and that's because he was an advisor to President Grover, and he then started questioning the whole notion of the Muslim identity, or how Orientalist gaze was starting to come about here in the States. And that question was put into place in 1892 when Frederick Law Olmsted and crew decided to design the World's Fair. And they started to basically, create, a very Eurocentric aesthetic as to what the World's Fair would be. but then giving an Orientalist gaze as to what the Muslim identity would be. And so Russell and crew were saying that, if you're going to bring in camels to identify, or if you're going to be designing minarets to identify the Muslim world, then we need to have that same kind of gaze towards the neoclassical European, whereas the neoclassical European exhibits were of locomotives, trains, vehicles, etc., while the Muslim gaze was more tribal. Along with that, there was the whole notion of belly dancing. So again, Orientalism at its finest, and so at this point, many Muslims in America were flabbergasted. They were up in arms, saying this is not how we identify ourselves, and so there was a lot of talk and conversation and unrest into how Muslims in America wanted to be identified. Hollywood really took advantage to that. So they really liked the whole Orientalist view. Here, while I sit in Hollywood, I still see the remnants of the Orientalist view. So colors like, Little Egypt, belly dancing, domes, genies, etc., was really perpetuated. But the most important thing was that in 1914, the United Negro Improvement Association basically came into a coalition into identifying themselves and trying to take back the perspective and the vision of what Muslims should be. And so roughly about 100,000 members were of Muslim descent. They practiced Islam. And they basically said, this is not the way that we want to be represented. And so they came together once again to create their own version of what mosques or Islamic architecture or what Muslim identity should be here in the US. A couple of tangents as well. So roughly in 1924, there's a restriction in the Immigration Acts. So this is at this point, US did not allow for many of the Asian and Muslim countries to allow for Muslim immigrations to come in. So at this point, there's kind of a stall, and the people who are carrying out the American Muslim identity are mostly African Americans. And then in 1952, we kind of upheave that and we say, okay, let's not restrict immigration from all Asia or all of Muslim background, but rather let's go ahead and pick out our favorite countries. And the favorite countries had to do with the idea of who we were basically in conversation with, who was pleasing us. And the people who were basically we were in partnership with then also got to dictate how our Muslim American identity would be. And those were Iran, Turkey, and Egypt. And one of the first things out of an olive branch or a way to say that this is our unification of our countries was that these three countries funded the very freestanding mosque, and I emphasize on the American Muslim Mosque in Washington, D.C. in 1957. So they got to dictate what the platform or what the architecture would be in America. President Eisenhower was very thrilled about this. Here he is giving and being at this opening of the mosque on June 28th. So at this point, we're like, ooh, okay, all right, American Muslims thriving. This is wonderful. And then by 1964, there's roughly about 1.1 million Muslims here, based on that Immigration Act. And then here we start to see what happens with those Immigration Acts is that by 1960, there's kind of like an influx, and then in the 1970s, 1980s, there's a huge influx of mosques being built. And this is because at this point in the 1960s, Saudi Arabia becomes Saudi Arabia. And so we have an alliance with them because of oil. And so one of the things that we decided to do was to say, okay, in trade of oil, you get to basically create communities. So you get to bring in many people from Saudi Arabia to the US. And from there, it was also the funding of mosques in America. So between 1980 and 1991, oil-rich countries started sponsoring many mosques. This is a mosque that's in New York. This is a 96th Street Mosque. This is designed by Skidmore, Owing and Merrill. And the interesting thing about it was that it was funded by the Emir of Kuwait. It did not originally have the dome or the minaret. It was just kind of lopped off at the end. Rockefeller came by and was like, no. What kind of a mosque would it be without it not having a dome or a minaret? They said, well, we're kind of done with funding. There's no more money. And Rockefeller said, here, how much does it cost? They said $1.5 million. He said, I'll donate. Please make sure that it has a dome and a minaret. So in lieu of us moving beyond the notion of identity of what a mosque would be, we now have the white man telling us what a mosque should be. And so many other mosques were then built. This mosque sits across the University of Southern California. It's not a very operating mosque, but you can see it's got the Chuck E. Cheese dome and the minaret as well. So we start identifying a lot with these iconic forms across the American landscape. But just to give you a platform, this is actually, we did this mapping. This is a map of all the African-American mosques. You can see that there are, majority of them reside in the hub, so very high congested main cities in America or outside of them. So they could be like, rural cities. And the rural cities, I mean, we counted when we did them, we counted for like everything that a community would say is a mosque. So it could be a garage mosque, it could be a standalone mosque, but you can see the majority of the hubs are in DC, in New York, and also in Northern California. And then this is all the other 2,100 mosques. So these are not African-American mosques, these are immigrant mosques. And what happens is, and then in the 80s, when suburbs in the United States were booming, this is when the mosques started to take place. The mosques were no longer at the center city or in downtown of cities, but rather in suburbs. And this is where the discrepancy starts to happen. It's because although African-American Muslims were the original identity of an American Muslim identity, many of the mosques that were built were not built in their communities, but rather they were built for the suburbs of the US. So you had to be of a social class, you had to have a car, you had to have a certain income in order to now be able to attend those mosques. And again, those mosques were also funded by outside countries, so oil-rich countries. So it also became that those countries were also buying land under their names as well. At this point, 9/11 takes place, and then we kind of have a problem because a lot of graffitis go up, and a lot of them say, go home. So the idea of where is home? So if you were to graffiti an African-American mosque, where is home? How far do you go back? Or if you were to graffiti an American Muslim of the 1960s, where is home for them? They've now lost their own identity. And then the other question becomes, when once again we had our elections, the complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States also came into play. So where do those Muslims go? And so the American Muslims basically had to rethink what is their identity in this form. And our research comes back is when we started to answer a lot of the questions is, when communities would come to us and say, okay, we would like to now design a mosque or create a new mosque because we want to create fresh blank slate about our identity. we would always constantly pose the question is, what is that identity? How far back do you want to go? Because if you're going to buy land, or if you're going to redo a building or create a mosque, is it going to be for everybody? Because the American Muslim identity means, you know, the slaves that also came in. It means the African Americans. So this immigrant mosque cannot go any further. So saying that we're going to create a mosque just for, you know, Middle Eastern cultures that speak, you know, Arabic, or let's say South Asian cultures that speak Urdu or other languages will not work anymore. So if we're going to start now designing or building within the American landscape, that means an inclusivity of all. And so it started to pose a lot of questions for many of the Muslims in America. The other questions that we started to really pay attention to was, you know, if we're designing for underrepresented minorities, in this particular case, the African Americans, what does that mean? Because when in the 1980s and through the 90s and all the way to 2001, when mosques were suburban mosques were being built in the United States that were funded by oil-rich countries, along with it came their culture. So let's say that in the, you know, in some other country, women were not allowed to attend a mosque, or if they were given the opportunity, it was in different buildings. So how does that translate into our American landscape? And so it basically, we had to go back and pull out Islamic texts or Islamic laws to say, look, there's no gender difference. There's actually gender equality in the holy city of Mecca, where the Kaaba resides and where every Muslim has to go to. Men and women pray side by side. They all circulate the Kaaba or the cube together. So how is that? That's like the holiest of all holy places. So how is your measly mosque going to be holier than, you know, the Kaaba itself? So then we started posing the question of gender equality, multiculturalism, and what does it mean in the American landscape? And then we started to show them, because a lot of communities, you know, said, oh, for example, you know, this is my hometown mosque. My grandfather, you know, had this dream of building his mosque, you know, of his, you know, city or a village or etc. from whatever country, here in, you know, in the middle of Manhattan or in the middle of Los Angeles. And we had to basically tell them, look, you taking those architectural ornamentation, you're basically orientalizing yourselves. So let's move beyond that and understand that when the Prophet said the whole earth is a mosque, he meant that, you know, you're supposed to take care of it. You're supposed to, each mosque is supposed to be vernacular. Each mosque is supposed to be a place where it actually serves the community, not for it to be, you know, of ornamentation. So when Adolf Loos said ornamentation is crime, he was very serious. It kind of, you know, brings it into our American mosque as well. So we really had to pose a lot of these questions. I think one of the best examples of the, you know, the late 80s and early 90s is of Hassan Fathy in Abiquiu, New Mexico, because whenever people pass by this place, they don't realize that it's a mosque. It's a rammed earth building. It's very sustainable. And so the questions of what is the identity of a mosque comes into play. It was like, is it really the dome or the minaret? Because that's from Byzantine architecture. Or is a mosque about sustainability, equity, inclusivity? So those are the questions that now we're playing with. After 9/11, we came about this idea of the prophetic mosque. So the prophetic mosque is the prophet himself, Muhammad, basically designed his very first mosque. There's nothing in any of the holy scriptures of what a mosque should be. There's no guidance. It just says the only guidance is pray towards the Kaaba, pray towards Mecca. That's it. You can stand anywhere, anytime, any place, and pray. But when Muhammad created his own mosque, he actually kind of set an example. It was an open air mosque. It was made out of rammed earth. It was in his courtyard. The direction of it was allocated, Mecca was allocated by a tree. Um, and to add to that, that was his home. So all of his doors, his living room, his bedroom, his dining room, everything opened up to that. So it was a place where the community congregated, but it was also his home as well. After 9/11, because of the safety of the Muslim American communities, many people resorted towards the prophetic mosque and started to create their own mosques in their homes. And we got commissioned to do lots of what we call Zen dens, people's basements, outdoor, tea houses that were converted, shacks, etc. And this one was done, probably about 5 or 6 years into it. It was a basement of a home of a professor in Washington, D.C. And he came to us and said, I have a community of roughly about 20 people. They've kind of lost their homes in the way, in the mosque. So, we need to create a space. And so we started playing around with what would that mosque look like in their homes. And we extracted concepts from the Quran as well. So this is from a chapter called The Light. So Allah, or God, is the light of the heavens and the earth. And we started designing a lot of architecture in that sense. He really wanted it to be inclusive of the Abrahamic faith. So we created this niche that would be there, 3 doors, so of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, to bring everybody together of the Abrahamic faith. Then in each of the columns, we basically wrapped around this emblem. So it would be the light. God is the lantern of the light. And so then it became a playful geometric patterns that would be within this, space for the prophetic mosque. This was one of our very first ones. A lot of people, after they visited or they had heard about this, many others in different communities had asked us to come in and do the same thing. And so all of a sudden, residential and Zen dens became, the bread and butter of MIIM Designs for a while, which was quite an interesting, thing that we never imagined would take place. But then from there, we started getting a lot of commissions of a retrofitted mosque. So communities started coming to us. And this is now more African-American communities, because they started to understand that we had a huge principle on the African-American Muslim identity. And they came to us in regards, and this one is the Marcus bookstore. This is a bookstore that the Black Panthers, a lot of the civil rights movements were taking place, activities. There was a lot of community events that took place in the 1960s and 50s, 60s, and 70s in this bookstore. When you go to it, it's actually quite a remarkable time capsule. The Marcus bookstore was basically in danger. The city, the state of California basically said we need to expand the highway, the 880 highway. And unless you have a really good reason of keeping the Marcus bookstore, we plan on actually taking down basically all of this whole area in order to expand Highway 880 in both directions, because we needed, freeways, because that's more important than people's homes. The irony of this is not only is this the Marcus bookstore, but this is, you kind of get off of Martin Luther King, and so there was a lot of history that took place. The owners of Marcus bookstore said, we cannot afford, to keep this bookstore running. And so initially they came to put it up for sale. When they came to put it up for sale, the BART and the highway system of California said, we'll buy it so that we can take down that whole lane. And a lot of the African-American community members were, up in open arms, because this was kind of part of their history. What happened was the Lighthouse Mosque came in and said, no, many of the people who grew up in that community came, and basically said, we're going to try to preserve it. And we will put up the first funds and we'll make it into a mosque itself. And that way there's a future home for it. When they did that, this is, the area, when they came to us to basically do the conceptual design, we said we would actually encourage you, in order to prevent it from being sold, is to buy all 3 parcels right next door. So this was the original Marcus bookstore, encouraging them to buy the 2 parcels next door to it in order for it to be an actual mosque. This is the interior of the bookstore itself. And our conceptual design was something of this nature, which we would keep the brickwork. We would actually design a lighthouse, making it kind of glowing beam. And the community was really for it. This raised enough money for it to move forward, and for it to basically come into fruition. Community members wanted it to have one big space for both men and women for them to pray. But the interesting thing about this particular mosque was that once we came into schematic and design development, and our team really did a lot of thinking, we and then in conversation with the state and the highway, transportation, they said, okay, fine, if you guys are actually going to build this, we will back up from buying that whole area of the highway, and we will, think of alternatives or think of different ways of, making sure that our traffic system flows well. So they kind of stepped back. And once they stepped back, we actually kind of encouraged the Lighthouse Mosque to give Marcus Bookstore back to its original owner. Although it hurt us financially, but we knew that we had principles in order to keep the, African-American history and legacy alive. The other projects that I want to share with you guys, in order to answer more of our questions is, again, when it comes to the idea of gender, race, and religion, what is the role of the architect? Because we saw in the Lighthouse Mosque, we played a significant role in order to keep history alive. But then how does that play into the rest of the mosques that are built? And so we started questioning our role as architects of architectural programming, and also sustainability and celebrating the local history. Which then brings me to another project. This is now Southern California, of home to a really big Muslim population. Their building sits right on Wilshire Boulevard, and the new Wilshire Temple is there, LACMA is there, Disney Concert Hall, Old Lady Church, the Broad Museum. So they kind of sit in a very significant part of Los Angeles. And when they bought this building, you can tell that, it used to be a bank. It was a mid-century modern bank. It has a neoclassical facade to it. And so far they've occupied it, but they don't know how to make it their own. And when we started to analyze it, we made sure that we wanted it to be sustainable. We actually want, this is one of our current projects, we want it to be in adherence to LA Green New Deal, so making sustainability a huge thing. They wanted to expand, there's not enough parking, so there's also codes, and the idea of both finance, codes, and et cetera comes into play. And so we really had to analyze and do a report, and to say, can we go up, or do we just expand in different forms? Is it even feasible? What are the implications of when it comes to sustainability and the Green New Deal? Because we want to make sure that as American Muslims, that is the priority, no longer is the priority of our identity, domes and minaret, but rather the identity of the whole earth, taking care of the earth as a place of worship. These are just quick interior views of the inside. You can see that the prayer halls of men and women are separate. Women are one place. men are of another place. Women don't have access to the main prayer space. They don't have access to, being able to see across the way. This is the exterior of a lot of overflow happens. Many people are not able to be part of the main prayer session, and so they end up praying in the parking lot. And then some of them also end up praying in the lunchroom. The beautiful thing about this particular community is that it has the foundation of the American Muslim identity. So inclusivity of race is there, but it still struggles with the issues of gender and making it sustainable. We continue to play on different verses of the Quran, and ultimately we ended up with a very nature-based biophiliac type of design, and really doing away with the idea of a neoclassical front, but either really incorporating a lot of landscape within the heart of Los Angeles that needs it badly, in order to make it more sustainable for the community. So what they really appreciated was the whole idea of the neoclassical facade going away, bringing in a lot of natural materials, but also incorporating it in a way that would allow for the American Muslim identity to, come to life, but also being very subtle about it. So allowing for one main prayer space. If the main prayer space is full, allowing for partitions to open, and and the partitions are actually swivel doors that allow for architectural programming to happen in different forms, but also not being so emphasis on the Orientalist architecture. So the mihrab is no longer what it used to be, but more subtleties. So all the prayer mats are given a direction towards Mecca. There's now a lecture hall that would be there. So if people are praying on one side, education or guest events could happen. If it needs to, the whole space opens up and it allows for one big, prayer space. And then most importantly, the idea of greening the space. So allowing to, a chunk of it or a third of the exterior to be removed and allowing for a more landscape to come through that's more lively of what is needed in Los Angeles. Yeah. I'll go ahead and stop there and I'll open it up for questions.
Thanks for the presentation. A lot of very interesting work. I'm curious about this very last project that you showed in LA. What was the process that you used in working with this community in terms of having a conversation about gender with them?
Yeah.
Where did that go? Or what was that like?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. So it's funny because a lot of communities, American Muslim communities that have been here for 3-4 generations, are very sensitive to the idea of gender. They oftentimes think, and it's really interesting because, when we were discussing, they kept telling me, "Oh, we're very progressive. We're very progressive," and I kept telling them, "I know you are. You came to us. I'm a female architect. That you kind of have to be progressive, in order to retain a female architect in order to do this project." But it also, they were kind of, having an internal battle as well, because on the exterior, they, we could see that they were very progressive. But when it came to the idea of prayer, and the very first time that we showed them these, conceptual graphics, they were kind of like, "Oh goodness, can we still separate men and women?" And we kind of had to go back and be like, "Look, Islamically, you're okay praying next to each other." We went through 4 participatory designs where at the beginning of it, I kind of had to give them a history of mosque architecture. I had to give them different Islamic law backgrounds. So there was extensive research that was being done. And then to basically tell them, "Look, we understand where your hesitancy is, it's going to be okay. And then, they had to kind of go back and rethink. And then they were like, oh, you're right. If the holiest of holy places is Mecca, and many men and women are shoulder to shoulder, that means that we're okay. So, yeah.
Sure. But the result though was that they were still sort of separating genders.
Initially, yeah.
Okay.
But now, no, they're comfortable with the idea.
They've grown into this. It's
Yeah,
been a process.
yeah.
Lots of times it's the most important thing an architect can do is just put it there in front of the client to have a conversation that doesn't need to be resolved with the project, but
Absolutely.
design the project in such a way that when that resolution comes, the building can respond to it.
Exactly. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
I was curious also, I love this term, this sentence you use, the whole earth is a mosque, the quote from the prophet. Is that a strong element in most communities that you've been working in? I mean, is this sort of something that, again, people are surprised to learn, I guess, in a way, the clients?
Yeah. So, I mean, in the last decade and a half that we've been kind of like, hacking at this and chiseling away at the community, they really grasped on the hadith, so which is the saying of the prophet, which is the whole earth is a mosque. It's with the elder generation, or the uncles that we like to reference them as, it's kind of hard because they're very nostalgic of holding down to roots of wherever the homeland is, so where their motherland is. So they want to still have some sort of nostalgic architecture of, that they can connect with. But when we, share that hadith with them, you can see that their eyes start getting like really wide. You can start seeing how they're starting to think through that, oh, you are right. The prophet did say that we're supposed to take care of the earth. We're able to pray everywhere. So how does the mosque actually give back to earth? How can it be sustainable? And it's interesting because we pose these kinds of questions and wait. And then in the next meeting, they come back with a list of, can we have solar panels? Yes, that's a great idea, but and so then we kind of have to hold their hand and move them beyond just solar panels, or, gray water systems, but rather, think through more, towards materials, more towards, really creating a sustainability, like project. So it's not just, in this particular project, they were really hung up on parking spaces, because they said, oh, at some point, we get roughly about 300 to 500 people. And I said, great. We now have, the metro, or the train that runs in. So we're gonna, and Los Angeles's Green New Deal allows for that. So we're gonna have, one of the stops. Let's work with the city so that one of the main stops becomes this area. I don't want to see, parking spaces. This is not what we're here for. Yeah.
Well, that's part of the culture of LA, right? I mean, we're always dealing with the context.
Exactly.
I was going to ask another question about the prophetic mosque that you talked about, and these mosques that are being built or you designed for the home, right? What were the projects you showed with the screen, 3 screens? What were the elements of the prophetic mosque in that project that you made sure that those were part of the design? I'm just wondering what those design elements were that you were giving.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we started naming those as prophetic because they were off to the side of homes. So very much like the Prophet's mosque himself.
Mhm.
So when the Prophet created his mosque, he created his home, and then the courtyard happened, and then
Yes.
that's where the community started to come in. So some of the homes that we were creating, or the prophetic aspect of it was, how do we separate the home itself, so the residential areas that
Mhm.
people were living, with the area of where a community can come together? Because ideally, you don't want, when you bring in, let's say, a community of 20 people, 30 people, you don't want them rummaging around your main area just to go down,
Yeah.
but reworking the residential itself so
Mhm.
that it has public access to it, but yet still be private for the main residents. So these were some of the elements that we had to start looking at, because the Prophet himself, when his daughters or his wives were all living there, they had their own entrances. And then they would also come into the courtyard to pray. But also the community never really went into his home. So many people don't even know what his home looked like. The other element that was there was that in the prophetic mosque for many years, the Muslim faith actually prayed towards Jerusalem. So this is why the idea of the 3 panels came about, so the Abrahamic faiths would come in. And it wasn't until later where Muslims believed that God commanded Muhammad to then turn towards Mecca and towards Kaaba, where Abraham built the cube to then pray in that direction.
Yeah.
So he, in his own home, he kind of made sure that the idea of Abrahamic elements were there. And many of these people, many of the American Muslim community wanted to make sure that the idea, the notion of the Abrahamic elements were there. So celebrating Judaism, Christianity, and Islam under one roof would be there for them.
I'm curious, in this prophetic mosque projects that were built, outside or next to the home, or what was the community or the neighborhood reaction to something like that? Or was there any kind of zoning issues that you had to deal with?
No, not at all, because most of them were either basements. Yeah, so that wasn't a problem, and or they were adjacent, freestanding structure of, like what would be like a shack.
Okay.
Yeah, so within the confined limits of the square footage, we were able to create these kinds of spaces for them.
Mhm.
And now what's interesting is, in California, in the state of California, with additional dwelling units, we're seeing a lot of that as well, where people want to have, the grandmother flat or the mother-in-law flat idea, but to be a place for them that's separated from the main residence, for them to be able to come together and either pray or separate from, if they don't have a mosque, or separate from the community for their way of practicing as well.
Yeah. Yes. Do we have questions from any audience folks here on?
I do have one more question
Yes.
that was put to me in the chat, which is, does Saudi Arabia still fund mosque construction in the US?
Mhm.
And does past or current foreign funding of a mosque influence the flavor of theology through architecture, like dividers, or assignment of a foreign national as imam?
Absolutely, yeah. Both are correct. So we used to laugh and say, when Saudi funded mosque, it was, we give you a mosque and we throw the imam in for free. So it's a buy one, get one free deal. And unfortunately with that, I mean, it's those 25 years in our American history has played a huge role in the American Muslim identity and the fabrication of Muslim communities in America. And we see that even now portrayed on TV as well, whether it's, vilifying, or in the Disney hit series of Miss Marvel, where Miss Marvel, the superhero, actually questions the imam, like, why am I sitting here in the back? Why is there a screen? And so it is the younger generation who are, questioning all of these. But to go back to the original question, currently, no mosques are being funded by Saudi. If they are, we're not aware of them. We don't take projects like that. But also, a lot of American Muslims are distancing themselves. They're trying to raise their own money, making them more of their own identity by, dictating what they want within the mosque. And yes, initially, when Saudi did fund mosques, they would dictate all the architectural elements and programming that would happen. But now that's not the case.
Yeah, and these buildings architecturally were, my impression of them was they were rather conservative and traditional, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Sort of, I was really surprised to hear about Iran and Turkey and Egypt funding the center in Washington, D.C. I was not even aware that was the case.
Yeah.
And what was it that those three countries sort of defined as an identity? What was it about that building that they had control over that resulted in what it looks like today?
Yeah. So when the Immigration Act took place, and so basically the US was like, we're going to cherry pick which countries we are liking. It's basically these three countries are the white countries. So Turkey identifies as white, Iran identifies as white, and Egypt, although part of North Africa, still identifies as white. So it became the white Muslims were allowed to come. And so that's one thing. The second thing was that there was a push and pull between the countries of how much they were going to fund or gift for this American mosque. And well, first, we have to recognize that the architect was of an Italian descent, so it was Mario Rossi. And so they basically told him, Iran was saying, okay, not only will we be giving you all the rugs, but we'll be giving you all of these tiles, and and so make it look like Isfahan in a sense. Egypt was saying, we'll be funding the minarets and any sort of the exterior, and Turkey basically was saying whatever's left over, we'll take it at just so that we're within the mix. But also, again, we have to look at what was also happening, in history horizontally. The coup d'etat had already taken place in Iran. It was really important for the Shah to align himself with a Muslim identity inside Iran and outside of Iran. So there was a lot of things that were taking place that this mosque basically, really put a Band-Aid on, and allowing for people, for different countries to represent themselves here in the US.
Yeah.
Well, I want to honor the time. We're at 8 o'clock. And I want to honor our amazing guest, Maryam. Thank you. That was really fascinating. I feel like we could go on for a long time. And what I'm really left with is how exciting the future of American Muslims and the architecture of mosques really is. It's really exciting to think about where this will go. And I know that you're going to play a huge part in that. Dr. Crosby, Mike, thank you so much for your very insightful questions and commentary. Hope to see you next time.